Hi, everybody. It's good to be back with you and to be getting into the book of Romans. So we're in first chapters 1, 2, and 3, signed this week. And, it's all about the gospel. Okay, but what is the gospel? That's the question that Paul is answering in these chapters of his book, his letter to the Romans. Paul shows us in Romans what the gospel is and what are its implications for life as Christians in Christian community, especially the kind of diverse communities like he describes, like I described last video. The most diverse city in the world, Rome, made for a very challenging community. For these new fledgling Christian communities. And I want you to see how Paul summarizes the gospel in the opening verses of chapter 1, verses 1 all the way through 17. It's very compact, and basically, to summarize, it's all about, it's all the news about Jesus. That's what the gospel is. It is the news about Jesus. And this news about Jesus reveals God's righteousness, which is, we saw it last video, God's faithfulness to the covenant that he made with his people Israel. All right, so righteousness from God is God's faithfulness to the promise that he made to Israel and his creation restoring justice that he's shown to the world through the life, death, resurrection, and reign of Jesus of Nazareth. The news about Jesus reveals God's righteousness, which is his faithfulness to his covenant, and his faithful justice to restore the creation from all that corrupts and destroys it. All right. So, restored from what? Well, the creation has been subjected to chaos and evil and death in the story of the Bible by human sin. We're going to see that in chapter 5 in large scale. All right. It's made subject to evil and death by human sin. Right. So against all that chaos, evil, and death, God's creation restoring justice is revealed in wrath. Wrath that purifies the world of that taint, of that evil, of that corruption. The Bible teaches that God will destroy what destroys his creatures. And that's the point that Paul is developing at length here in chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Romans. In chapter 1, he's showing how the Gentiles merit God's wrath for the evil that they do in suppressing the truth, in their idolatry, where they turn creatures into idols that they worship in place of the Creator, and in their manifold perversions, sexual perversions, perversions in how they treat themselves, how they treat each other. God's wrath is revealed in the gospel against all these things. Now, if you've ever struggled with the question, how can God condemn those who have never heard of Jesus? That's a big question that a lot of people have asked for a very long time. How does Paul answer that question here in Romans chapter 1? As you read it, or as you go back and read it, I want you to be looking for his answer to that question. All right. Now, as Paul is laying out God's case against the Gentiles, he knows that there might be some self-satisfied Jewish people hearing his critique of those Gentiles, nodding and saying, thinking that they are sitting pretty because they're the good people. They obey God's law. They are among his people. They are circumcised. They have all the promises of God. So then in chapter 2, Paul addresses them directly, showing how Jews too, and Paul is speaking of himself because he himself was a very studious and diligent, well-meaning Jewish believer, follower of God, how Jews too merit God's wrath. Okay, so watch how he builds that case against his fellow Jews. So then at the end of chapter 2, with both Jews and Gentiles clearly under God's wrath, Paul now lays out the dilemma that God has. On the one hand, he wants to restore his creatures, not destroy them. But on the other hand, they are engaged in evil doing. They are subject to his unavoidable justice and wrath for corrupting and destroying the creatures of God. So how does God resolve this dilemma? Well, chapter 3 shows how, or begins to show how, okay? God is able to bring both justice to the Jews and Gentiles for the evil that they do, and to bring mercy and grace to them as well. And how does he do that? Well, the easy answer is, the simple answer is, well, he does it in Christ. And he summarizes that beautifully in Romans chapter 3, verse 26, where he says, Paul demonstrates, he makes a quick case in Romans 3 for how God is able to be both just, bringing wrath to those who destroy God's creatures, and the justifier of those among them who put their trust in Jesus. He's able to be just and to justify. And he does that in Christ Jesus. So as you read chapter 3, I want you to be very alert to how Jesus is able to resolve this dilemma. It's so beautiful. It's so profound. It's so inspiring of worship and gratitude. I hope you take some time to pick through Paul's very dense writing and summarize it for yourself, because it just will lead us to worship. It's so beautiful. And then in chapter 4, Paul shows that this gift of justification received by faith is given to both Jew and Gentile, just as Abraham experienced it when he was, technically speaking, a Gentile, before he was circumcised, before he was brought into any kind of covenant relationship with Yahweh, before the law of Moses was ever given, when Abraham was himself a Gentile, he received justification by faith in God. That's in chapter 4. And that wraps us up for this week. I hope you're enjoying your study of the book of Romans. And if you want a little help as you go, I recommend that you get the ESV Study Bible. It's got an excellent introduction to Paul's writing. And then it's got also a very accessible verse-by-verse commentary that will help explain Paul's points, his language, his argument, that will help to kind of unknot some of those very densely written, deep, technical vocabulary in Paul's writing. So ESV Study Bible is a great resource. Thanks. God bless you all, and I'll see you in the next video.